Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really pivotal 70 years in American history,
Yeah.
1790 right up to 1860.
Yeah, this is when things just explode, really. The U.S. goes from being, these scattered sort of local places
Right.
to this dynamic, continent-spanning economy driven by markets. It's a massive shift.
We're digging into what's called the market revolution. And our goal here is to unpack how all these moving parts, people migrating, incredible new technologies, a whole new transportation system, how they all mesh together.
Exactly. How they created this national economy we start to recognize.
And for you listening, the big thing to grasp is that fundamental change from, like, making or growing just what your family needed
Subsistence living.
to being part of these bigger, complex market relationships. Suddenly, a farmer out in Ohio is connected to a factory owner back in Massachusetts.
Yeah, and Ralph Waldo Emerson really nailed it. He saw this connection, saying, whenever I see a railroad, I look for a republic.
Interesting. So the infrastructure itself was building the nation.
In a way, yeah. The physical ties were kind of forging the political ones.
Okay, so let's start with the people, just sheer movement. The U.S. population was young, right? Like half the country under 30 by 1850.
Incredibly young and constantly pushing west. This restlessness, this energy, it even shapes the presidency. Think Andrew Jackson, first one from beyond the Appalachians.
But it sounds pretty romanticized sometimes. The reality for pioneers? It was tough.
Oh, incredibly tough. Grim, really. Our sources talk about the Lincoln family, for instance, living for a whole year in basically a three-sided shed made of sticks.
Wow.
Yeah. Pioneers were often sick, didn't have enough food or decent clothes, and just profoundly lonely. Disease was rampant.
And this westward push had ecological consequences too, this idea of ecological imperialism.
Right. It was this really aggressive, almost careless exploitation of resources. Think about the beaver trade or the bison herds.
Hunted almost to extinction for pelts and robes.
Exactly, just decimated.
But it wasn't all destruction, right?
Yeah.
Wasn't there a counter-reaction even back then?
There was, fascinatingly. The painter George Catlin, back in 1832, he saw the Sioux trading buffalo tongues for whiskey and was just horrified by the waste.
And he had an idea.
He did. He was actually the first person to propose creating a national park system to preserve these areas. Took a while. Obviously, Yellowstone wasn't until 1872, but the idea started there.
So while Americans are moving west, you've got this other huge wave of people coming in from Europe.
Absolutely. Population's doubling every 25 years anyway from births, but then immigration just explodes in the 1840s and 50s, triples, then quadruples, mainly Irish and Germans.
Let's talk about the Irish first. Fleeing the potato famine, the Black 40s, right?
Yeah, a devastating time. Over 1.5 million came, but they arrived with almost nothing, too poor to buy land and head west.
So they stayed in the cities.
They did. Clustered in places like Boston and New York. Conditions were awful. Poverty, squalor. New York, for a time, actually had more Irish people than Dublin.
And they faced a lot of prejudice, those no Irish need apply signs, Nina.
Yep, NI signs were common. And because they were desperate for any work, they ended up competing with black workers, which sadly led to a lot of tension and conflict.
How did they cope?
Through community. Organizations like the Ancient Order of Hibernians were vital for mutual aid, just helping each other survive.
Okay, then the Germans. Similar numbers, almost 1.5 million, but different circumstances.
A bit different, yeah. Many Germans arrived with more money or skills. Some were political refugees, liberals fleeing failed revolutions back in Europe, like Karl Schurz, educated, politically active.
And they moved further inland.
Generally, yes. Many headed to the Midwest, especially Wisconsin, and they brought distinct contributions of the Conestoga wagon, the Kentucky rifle, even kindergarten.
But they weren't always welcomed with open arms either.
No, the older, more puritanical American stock often viewed them suspiciously. Their tendency to form separate communities, speak German, and especially their Continental Sunday.
What was that? Just relaxing on a Sunday?
Pretty much. Enjoying beer gardens, socializing on the Sabbath. This really clashed with the strict Sunday observance laws common in Protestant areas.
So all these immigrants, especially the large number of Catholics, Catholicism became the biggest single denomination by 1850?
That's right.
That must have caused anxiety.
Huge anxiety. It fueled a really strong nativist backlash. People genuinely feared being outbred, outvoted, and overwhelmed.
And this fear manifested in some ugly ways.
Definitely. You had sensationalist, anti-Catholic books like Maria Monk's Awful Disclosures selling hundreds of thousands of copies.
Claiming to expose secrets of convents.
Right. And politically, it led to secret societies like the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner, which morphed into the Know Nothing Party.
The know-nothings, because they were supposed to say, I know nothing, when asked about it.
Exactly. Their whole platform was about restricting immigration and naturalization. And sadly, it wasn't just talk. There was real violence. A convent burned in Boston in '34. Deadly riots in Philadelphia in '44.
So, a lot of social tension brewing. Meanwhile, how's the economy actually making things? The industrial side.
Well, the Industrial Revolution hits Britain first around 1750. It was slower coming to the U.S. Land was cheap, labor was scarce, capital was hard to come by initially.
But then comes Samuel Slater.
Ah, yes, the father of the factory system. Quite the story. He basically memorized British textile machine plans.
Memorized them.
Yep. Escaped Britain in disguise, came to America, and boom, sets up the first really efficient cotton thread spinning machinery in Rhode Island in 1791.
Okay, so now America can spin cotton. But you need the raw cotton first, and separating the seeds was slow work.
Until Eli Whitney, his cotton gin, 1793, it was revolutionary, 50 times more effective than picking seeds out by hand.
And the impact was just immense.
Immense and, frankly, tragic in a way. It instantly made large-scale cotton production profitable, which meant the South became completely wedded to king cotton and, crucially, to expanding slavery.
But Whitney wasn't done. He also helped the North industrialize, didn't he,
Yeah.
with interchangeable parts.
That's the other side of his legacy, absolutely vital. In 1798, working on muskets for the government, he comes up with this idea of making identical interchangeable components using machines.
Which is the basis for.
Modern mass production, assembly lines, everything. It fundamentally shaped northern industry, while the cotton gin shaped the South. Divergent paths.
And other inventions followed fast. Sewing machines.
Elias Howe in '46, then Isaac Singer improves it. Suddenly, ready-made clothing becomes a big industry.
And the telegraph. Samuel Morse, 1844. What have God wrought?
That message just zipped across the wires. Communication changed overnight.
All this new industry, these big investments, they needed new ways to structure businesses, right? Legally.
For sure. That's where concepts like limited liability become really important. It meant investors weren't personally ruined if a company failed. They only lost what they put in.
Made people more willing to risk capital.
Exactly. And states started passing free incorporation laws. New York was first in 1848. This let businesses form corporations more easily, without needing a special act from the legislature each time. It streamlined everything.
Okay, so factories are booming. But what about the workers? Conditions weren't great, were they? Long hours, low pay, child labor, sometimes called wage slavery.
No, conditions were often brutal, especially early on. Significant numbers of workers were children, some under 10. Hours were long, pay was low, workplaces were unsafe.
If it was so bad, why didn't more workers just head west? Land was still relatively cheap.
That's a great question. Some did, but many stayed and organized. As more working men got the vote in the 1820s and 30s, they started forming trade unions.
What were they fighting for?
Basic stuff, mostly. A 10-hour workday was a huge demand. They also pushed hard for public education for their kids. President Van Buren actually established the 10-hour day for federal employees in 1840.
And there was a key court case?
Yes, Commonwealth v. Hunt in Massachusetts, 1842. This was massive. The court ruled that labor unions weren't illegal conspiracies as long as their goals and methods were honorable and peaceful.
So it legitimized unions.
It gave them legal standing, which was a major victory.
How did all this industrial work affect women?
Well, for some, factory jobs, like the famous Lowell factory girls, offered a taste of economic independence, at least for young, single women.
But that was usually temporary.
Overwhelmingly, yes. Most working women were single. Once they married, the expectation was they'd leave the factory and embrace the cult of domesticity.
Explain that cult of domesticity.
It was this powerful cultural idea that glorified the woman's role as the homemaker, the moral center of the family. It emphasized a strict separation between the man's public sphere of work and the woman's private sphere of the home.
But even within that sphere, things were changing. You mentioned domestic feminism.
Right. It sounds like a contradiction, but it refers to women asserting more control within the home. The most striking evidence is the falling birth rate.
Fewer children.
Dramatically fewer. The fertility rate for white women dropped by half across the 19th century. This suggests women were making conscious decisions to limit family size.
Family dynamics shifted.
Yeah, families generally became smaller, more focused on affection and nurturing children rather than just demanding obedience, more child-centered.
Okay, so people are moving, factories are churning out goods. But how do you connect everything? Get cotton to the mills, food to the cities?
That's the third leg of the stool, the transportation evolution. The need for cheap, reliable ways to move goods and people over vast distances was just critical.
What came first? Roads.
Yeah, turnpikes. Private companies built toll roads like the Lancaster Turnpike in Pennsylvania in the 1790s. It was profitable and sparked a boom. The federal government got involved too, building the National Road or Cumberland Road, pushing west into Illinois by 1839.
But roads have limits. Water was key, right? Steamboats.
Absolutely. Robert Fulton's Claremont in 1807 was the game changer. Steaming up the Hudson proved you could go against the current reliably.
Made rivers two-way highways.
Exactly. Suddenly, the Mississippi River system could be navigated upstream efficiently, linking the West and South in a new way.
But the real breakthrough for connecting East and West was canals.
Canals were huge, especially the Erie Canal. This was a New York State project pushed by Governor DeWitt Clinton, finished in 1825. An amazing feat of engineering, 363 miles long.
Connecting the Great Lakes to the Hudson River and thus to New York City.
Right. And the economic impact was just staggering.
What kind of impact?
Think about this. The cost to ship a ton of grain from Buffalo to New York City dropped from $100 to $5.
Wow. From $100 to $5.
And the time dropped from 20 days to 6. It spurred explosive growth along its route cities like Rochester, Syracuse, and it basically undercut New England farmers, forcing them into factory work or driving them west themselves.
But even canals had limitations. Then came the railroad.
The Iron Horse, yes, started appearing in 1828. Railroads were faster, more reliable, could operate year-round, and could go places canals couldn't.
And they spread quickly.
Very quickly. By 1860, the U.S. had 30,000 miles of track. And here's a crucial point. 3/4 of that mileage was in the north.
Connecting the industrial East with the agricultural West.
Precisely. Early railroads had issues, accidents, different track gauges, weak brakes, but they were the future.
Were there other transport innovations around this time?
There were brief, flashy moments. The clipper ships in the 1840s and 50s were incredibly fast sailing ships, great for high-value cargo like tea or gold rush passengers.
But they didn't last.
Not really. They sacrificed cargo space for speed, and the British iron-hulled steamships slower but steadier and carrying much more soon dominated ocean trade.
And the Pony Express. That feels iconic.
Iconic but short-lived. Started in 1860, carried mail 2,000 miles overland in an astonishing 10 days. An amazing feat of endurance. But it lost money and only lasted 18 months. The telegraph reached California in 1861, and that was that. The machine age had truly arrived.
So putting it all together, people, industry, transport, you get the market revolution.
Yeah.
And it creates this interconnected national economy.
Absolutely. And one key outcome is how it shifted trade patterns. The natural flow used to be down the Mississippi to New Orleans,
Right.
But the canals and railroads, especially the Erie Canal, pulled trade eastward. By the 1840s, more Western goods were going through Buffalo towards New York than downriver to New Orleans. New York City became the undisputed economic capital.
And this led to regional specialization.
Yes, a clear division of labor emerged across the continent. The South overwhelmingly focused on growing cotton for export.
The West, raising grain and livestock.
Yeah.
Cincinnati becomes Porkopolis, the big meatpacking center.
And the East, making the machines, the textiles, the finished goods, manufacturing.
What's the political significance of that East-West connection?
It's huge, especially looking ahead to the Civil War. This strong economic interdependence bound the Northeast and the Midwest tightly together. They became, as you said earlier, like conjoined twins economically.
Which undermines Southern assumptions.
Exactly. Many in the South assumed the upper Mississippi Valley states, reliant on the river, would naturally side with them if secession happened. But the railroads and canals had reoriented their economic interests eastward.
Did the legal system keep pace with this economic change?
It did, often encouraging it. There's the Charles River Bridge case decided by Chief Justice Taney. Basically, it prioritized the rights of the community over older, exclusive corporate charters, meaning it favored competition. It allowed newer companies or state projects like bridges or canals to compete with older monopolies, fostering more growth and innovation. encouraging entrepreneurs.
Now, this whole market revolution, it clearly generated a lot of wealth. You
Yeah.
hear about figures like John Jacob Astor.
Right. The fur trader turned real estate mogul left something like $30 million when he died in 1848, an astronomical sum then. The potential for massive wealth was definitely there.
But did everyone benefit? Was prosperity widespread?
Well, overall wealth did increase. Wages for workers did rise slowly, maybe about 1% per year between 1820 and 1860.
But
But inequality grew dramatically. The gap between the wealthy elite and the working poor widened significantly. Cities saw the rise of a large, often struggling, wage-earning class, and even a population of unskilled, transient drifters. Prosperity was real, but very unevenly distributed.
so looking back over these 70 years,
Yeah.
it's just a staggering transformation from scattered settlements and farms.
To this complex, interconnected, industrializing nation linked by rails and wires, all driven by the market.
And you argue this new economic map was a major factor leading into the Civil War.
Absolutely. That tight economic bond between the North and the Midwest, forged by this revolution, was a powerful force holding the Union together, economically at least. It shaped the strategic landscape of the coming conflict.
We started by talking about westward expansion and this ideal of self-reliance. Yet the market revolution seems to demand the opposite. Deep interdependence between regions, that feels like a tension.
It is a tension.
So a final thought for our listeners. How did American ideas about individualism and local control have to bend or change, both in law and just in culture, to make room for this powerful, interconnected national economy? Something to think about.